In 1900, the average American kitchen ran on a substance most people alive today have never once cooked with on purpose. It sat in a can on nearly every pantry shelf in the country, and it built empires, funded wars, and helped invent the modern grocery store. Today you can barely find it in the supermarket without hunting for it, and if you mention it at a dinner party, you will probably get a grimace instead of a nod. That substance is lard. Rendered pig fat, white and unglamorous, was once the single most important cooking fat in the Western world, the base of everything from fried chicken to pie crust to the biscuits that fed soldiers and settlers alike. Now it is treated as a relic, a punchline, a symbol of unhealthy excess, something your grandmother used because she did not know any better. But that framing is not history. It is marketing. And it took an extraordinary amount of money, propaganda, and outright corporate sabotage to convince an entire nation to forget what it once knew in its bones, that this humble white fat was not a mistake of the past, but one of the most versatile, economical, and quietly powerful substances in human history. So how does a fat that once ran through the veins of the American economy, that soldiers were asked to save for their country, that chefs today are quietly bringing back into fine dining kitchens, become something people are almost embarrassed to admit they use? How did an ingredient found in ancient burial rites and medieval feast halls end up rebranded as backwoods and unsophisticated within the span of a single century? The answer involves a Cincinnati pork empire, a cottonseed oil byproduct nobody wanted, a marketing campaign built on manufactured disgust, a wartime government begging citizens to save their kitchen grease for bullets, and a health panic that, decades later, turned out to be aimed at the wrong villain entirely. This is the strange, surprisingly high-stakes story of lard. How it built fortunes, fed nations, fell from grace, and is now quietly clawing its way back onto the plates of people who never stopped needing it in the first place. Long before lard had a name, it had a purpose. Rendering fat from a slaughtered animal was not a culinary choice. It was one of the oldest survival technologies humans ever developed. Strip away the meat, and you were left with muscle, bone, and organ, all of it perishable within days. But render the fat down over low heat, and you unlocked something that could be stored for months, carried across long distances, and used as fuel for lamps, waterproofing for leather, medicine for wounds, and calories dense enough to keep a body alive through a lean winter. In a world without refrigeration, fat was not indulgence. Fat was insurance. Every pig, cow, sheep, or goat a family slaughtered was rendered down to its most useful, most stable form, and that form was grease. Nothing about this was casual. Across ancient societies, the act of slaughtering an animal was wrapped in ceremony because it had to be. A slaughter meant a family or a village would eat well for a short, precious window, and that abundance demanded acknowledgement. Fat, specifically, took on an almost sacred status because it was the part that burned brightest, kept longest, and represented the richest offering an animal had to give. Religious and ceremonial texts from multiple ancient cultures describe animal fat being burned specifically as an offering to deities, its smoke considered the most valuable part of the sacrifice, rising upward as a kind of edible prayer. The choicest portions were not the lean cuts modern diners would prize today. They were the fat, the very thing our current era has trained itself to trim away and discard. Beyond religion, rendered fat carried enormous practical status in the household economy. A family that successfully rendered and stored a season's worth of fat had effectively banked calories, the ancient equivalent of a full pantry, and a padded savings account combined. Communities built entire seasonal rhythms around it, timing slaughters to the cold months when the fat would render cleanly and the finished product would keep without spoiling. The process itself was laborious and communal by necessity, requiring hours of tending a fire, skimming impurities, and pouring the liquid gold into vessels for storage, work that often fell to multiple hands working together rather than a single household. This was not a fringe practice, confined to one region or one people. Variations of fat rendering, storage, and ceremonial use appear across ancient agricultural societies wherever domesticated animals were raised, and winters demanded stored calories. The specific animal changed with geography and available livestock, but the underlying logic remained remarkably consistent. Nothing of value was wasted, and fat was among the most valuable things an animal produced. By the time organized states and empires began keeping written records, rendered animal fat was already ancient technology, embedded so deeply into how people ate, celebrated, worshipped, and survived that nobody thought to question it. It simply was how food worked. That inherited logic, fat as currency, fat as ceremony, fat as survival, would travel forward through centuries largely unchanged, waiting for a very different kind of society to inherit it and put it to entirely new uses. Cross the Atlantic to the muddy clearings of colonial America, and you find that inherited logic alive and thriving, only now dressed in homespun and armed with a musket. The hog, more than any other animal, became the linchpin of frontier survival, and for good reason. Pigs were absurdly efficient. They required no pasture, ate whatever scraps and forest master family could not otherwise use, and reproduced fast enough to outpace nearly any other livestock investment a settler could make. A single sow could turn acorns and kitchen garbage into a winter's worth of meat, and crucially, into gallons of rendered fat that would mean the difference between surviving February and starving in it. By the 18th century, hog butchering had evolved into one of the great recurring set pieces of American rural life, an event so central that entire calendars were built around it. Families waited for the first hard freeze, timing the slaughter to those same cold, fly-free days their ancestors had relied on for centuries. Then, the whole neighborhood converged. This was not a chore one household handled alone. Butchering day summoned uncles, cousins, and neighbors, everyone arriving with knives, kettles, and an understanding that the labor would be repaid in kind when it was their turn to slaughter. Nothing on that hog went unclaimed. The hams and shoulders were salted or smoked. The intestines became sausage casing. The blood became pudding. And the fat, mountains of it, went into the rendering kettle, bubbling for hours over an open fire until it separated into pale, clean lard and crisp, savory cracklings that themselves became a treasured byproduct, tossed into cornbread or eaten straight as a farmhouse delicacy. Once cooled and packed into crocks, that lard became the single most versatile substance in the household. It fried the morning's cornmeal mush, greased the griddle for flapjacks, sealed jars of preserved meat and fruit against air and spoilage, waterproofed boots and tool handles, and even fueled crude lamps when tallow or oil ran short. In cash-poor frontier communities, where coin was scarce and credit was mostly a matter of trust between neighbors, lard functioned as something remarkably close to currency. A crock of lard could be traded at the general store for sugar, nails, or fabric, its value stable and universally understood in a way that paper money on the frontier frequently was not. Store ledgers from the period routinely list lard alongside furs and grain as accepted payment. Proof that this rendered fat was not a humble kitchen afterthought, but a recognized unit of economic exchange. Entire household economies were, quite literally, built on grease. And as westward expansion pushed farming families deeper into new territory, they carried this same ritual with them, replicating the hog butchering calendar on the prairies of Ohio, Indiana, and eventually the Midwest, planting the cultural and agricultural seeds for what would soon become a full-blown industrial empire built on fat. Here is the story most people believe. Lard was the food of the desperate, the fat of dirt floors and empty pockets, a greasy shorthand for poverty itself, eaten only by those who could not afford butter and shunned by anyone with money or taste. It is a tidy narrative. It is also wrong. Walk into the kitchens of European aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, and you will find lard treated not as a shameful substitute, but as an essential technical tool, prized specifically for what it could do that butter could not. French and English pastry cooks relied on rendered pork fat to achieve the flaky, shattering layers that define classic pie crusts and laminated doughs, because lard's particular crystalline fat structure creates larger, more stable pockets of steam during baking than butter's softer fat does. Professional bakers did not use lard because they were poor. They used it because it produced a superior crust. Full stop. The same logic held in elite American households well into the 20th century. Fine cookbooks aimed squarely at wealthy urban housewives, the kind stocked with silver serving trays and household staff, called for lard in pastry, in frying, in cake batters, treating it as a standard pantry ingredient rather than a mark of shame. Class, in other words, determined how lard was talked about far more than whether it was actually used. The wealthy called it shortening, or referred to it by brand and provenance. The poor simply called it lard, and used every last spoonful without apology. Both were reaching for the same crock. So where did the poverty myth come from? Largely from the 20th century itself, retroactively projected backward. As new refined vegetable fats entered the market and marketers needed a foil to sell against, lard was recast as the fat of the past, the fat of the unsophisticated, the fat your grandmother used because she did not know any better. That framing required erasing lard's long, unglamorous, and genuinely cross-class history, and erasing, too, the inconvenient fact that professional chefs continued quietly using it precisely because nothing else performed as well in a pie crust. The myth persists today, mostly because it is convenient. It lets modern audiences imagine a clean line between old, poor, unhealthy eating and new, refined, health-conscious eating, when the actual history is messier and considerably more interesting. Lard was not a mark of poverty. It was, for centuries, simply the fat everyone reached for, rich and poor alike, because it worked. The distinctions people layered on top of it later had far more to do with marketing than with the substance itself, a pattern that becomes impossible to miss once industrial money enters the picture. By the middle of the 19th century, the crock on the kitchen shelf was about to meet the factory floor, and nothing about lard would ever be small-scale again. Cincinnati got there first. The city had earned itself the nickname Porkopolis, a place where hogs arrived by the thousands, were slaughtered on tight industrial schedules, and were processed with an efficiency that would have stunned any farm wife working alone with a kettle and a ladle. Packers in Cincinnati pioneered what amounted to an assembly line for pigs decades, before Henry Ford applied the same logic to automobiles, moving carcasses through a sequence of specialized stations where workers repeated a single task hundreds of times a day. Rendering, once a household chore performed once a year after the first hard freeze, became a year-round industrial process performed at a scale no family farm could match. Fat that once simmered in a single iron pot now cooked in enormous vats, refined, filtered, and packed for shipment to grocers across the country. Chicago soon overtook Cincinnati as the center of the industry, its stockyards consolidating the slaughter and processing of animals from across the entire Midwest into a single sprawling operation. Refrigerated rail cars extended Lard's reach further still, allowing packers to ship a perishable product over distances that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. What had been a local, seasonal, communal ritual was now a national commodity chain. The entrepreneurs behind this transformation were not romantics preserving tradition. They were businessmen who recognized that a byproduct considered so ordinary that farm households barely thought to sell it could, at industrial scale, become enormously profitable. They branded it, tinned it, standardized its texture and color, and sold it back to the very population that had once rendered it themselves. Think about that for a second. Within a single generation, millions of Americans went from making their own lard every winter to buying it in a can stamped with a company name. The shift mirrored a broader pattern occurring across the American food economy in this period, as flour, sugar, and canned goods all moved from home production to industrial supply chains. Lard was simply an early and particularly visible example, riding the same rail lines and stockyard infrastructure that were reshaping the nation's diet. And it worked spectacularly well, at least for a while. Industrial lard was cheaper, more consistent, and more widely available than anything a household could produce on its own, and it dominated American pantries by the turn of the 20th century, a fixture in kitchens rich and poor, precisely as it had been for generations before, only now delivered by rail instead of by neighbor. But industrialization had done something else too, something the packers themselves may not have fully appreciated at the time. It had turned lard into a commodity with margins, competitors, and boardrooms, which meant it had also, unknowingly, opened the door to a rival product that did not come from a pig at all, one being quietly developed in a laboratory using an entirely different raw material. And the company behind it was about to change the story of cooking fat forever. That rival began, oddly enough, as garbage. Cottonseed oil was a byproduct of the cotton industry, a greasy sludge left over after ginning that had once been considered nearly worthless, sometimes even dumped into rivers because nobody could figure out a profitable use for it. Cincinnati soap and candle maker Procter & Gamble knew cottonseed oil intimately because they already used it as a cheap raw material for making soap. Company chemists, tinkering with a process called hydrogenation, a method that used hydrogen gas and a metal catalyst to turn liquid oil into a solid, white, shelf-stable fat, discovered something curious. The solidified cottonseed oil looked almost exactly like lard. It behaved like lard in a mixing bowl, and crucially, it could be manufactured without a single hog, a single slaughterhouse, or a single unpredictable livestock market driving up costs. Procter & Gamble had originally intended to sell the hydrogenated oil as a candle substitute, since the company's candle business was being squeezed by the rise of electric lighting. But someone inside the company noticed the product's culinary potential, and in 1911 Procter & Gamble launched it not as wax, but as food, under a brand name built to sound clean, modern and vaguely scientific. Crisco, short for crystallized cottonseed oil. This is where the marketer archetype enters the story in full force. Procter & Gamble did not simply sell Crisco as an alternative to lard. It sold Crisco as an upgrade, a repudiation, almost a moral improvement over the animal fat that had greased American kitchens for 3 centuries. The company's advertising campaigns leaned hard into language of purity and modernity, describing Crisco as an all-vegetable product free from the supposedly unpleasant realities of rendered animal fat. At a moment when growing public awareness of unsanitary meatpacking conditions, the same conditions exposed in Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel The Jungle, had already left many consumers deeply uneasy about anything originating in a slaughterhouse. Crisco advertising offered recipe booklets, cooking demonstrations, and endorsements designed to insert the product directly into the domestic rituals Lard had once owned, teaching a new generation of home cooks that white, odorless, vegetable-derived shortening was the clean, respectable choice, while lard was quietly recast as the greasy, old-fashioned, faintly embarrassing fat of an earlier era. Sales climbed steadily through the 1910s and 20s, not because Crisco was healthier in any way that would later be substantiated, but because the propaganda worked. Perception, not nutrition, was reshaping the American pantry. Lard did not vanish immediately, but the psychological groundwork had been laid for its long decline. And the company that built that groundwork had done something remarkable. It had turned an industrial waste product into a beloved staple by convincing millions of people that the past itself was something to be ashamed of. Then came a war, and lard stopped being a domestic embarrassment and became a military necessity overnight. Fat, it turned out, was not just food, it was chemistry. Rendered animal fat contains glycerin, and glycerin is a key ingredient in nitroglycerin, the explosive compound used in artillery shells, bombs, and ammunition propellant. Suddenly, the greasy substance Crisco advertising had spent 2 decades mocking as backward and unsanitary was reclassified, in the language of wartime bureaucracy, as a strategic material. Governments on both sides of the Atlantic launched fat salvage campaigns, urging, then practically demanding, that housewives save every drop of cooking grease left over from bacon, roasts, and drippings, and turn it into local butchers or collection depots rather than pour it down the drain. Posters appeared in kitchens and grocery stores, featuring cheerful illustrations of tin cans and slogans that reduced the entire war effort to a matter of domestic thrift, something along the lines of saving grease to save lives, or turning kitchen fat into shells for the front. It was propaganda every bit as deliberate as Crisco's earlier campaigns, only this time the target was not a shift in taste, but a shift in behavior, and the currency was patriotism rather than purity. Radio broadcasts and newspaper columns instructed women, and it was overwhelmingly women who were addressed, on the proper procedure: strain the fat through cheesecloth, store it in a clean can, keep it away from heat, and deliver it regularly, because a shortfall in kitchen grease meant a shortfall in explosives. Butchers who accepted the donated fat paid a few cents per pound, turning patriotism into a small transaction, and meat rationing made the stakes even sharper, since fat had become scarce precisely when the military needed it most. Think about that for a second. The same fat that had once been dismissed as the greasy relic of a horse and plough economy was now essential to modern industrial warfare, quietly propping up the production of the very munitions being fired across Europe and the Pacific. It is a strange kind of irony that a substance marketed as old-fashioned in peacetime became indispensable the moment the world went to war. and that the housewives dutifully pouring bacon grease into coffee cans were, in their small way, participating in the machinery of global conflict without necessarily grasping the full extent of it. The fat drives did more than supply raw material. They also kept lard, and the broader culture of saving and rendering fat, alive in the public imagination at precisely the moment industrial food marketing had been trying to bury it. An entire generation of home cooks, who might otherwise have abandoned rendered fat entirely, were instead reminded, through official channels no less, that the substance had value, that it mattered, that it was worth the trouble of straining and storing. When the war ended, that reprieve would prove temporary. The forces that had spent decades working to displace lard from the American kitchen had not disappeared. They had simply been interrupted, and in the post-war decades they would return with a new weapon entirely, one dressed not in the language of patriotism or purity, but in the language of science. Peace returned, and so did the marketing war, except this time it borrowed the authority of laboratories instead of the language of flags and rationing boards. The post-war decades produced a new kind of villain in the American diet, one invisible to the naked eye and impossible for a home cook to argue with. Cholesterol, animal fats, lard chief among them, were recast almost overnight from wholesome kitchen staples into suspected agents of heart disease, and the vegetable oil industry, which had spent half a century trying to dislodge lard through advertising alone, now had something far more persuasive to work with: the appearance of medical consensus. Nutrition science of the era was genuinely wrestling with rising rates of heart disease, and there were real researchers asking real questions about diet and cardiovascular health. But the research landscape was also something else entirely. A battlefield where food manufacturers funded studies, placed articles, and courted health organizations, all while insisting their interest was purely in the public good. Saturated fat became the enemy, and lard, being roughly 40% saturated fat, found itself on trial in a courtroom where the vegetable oil industry had already bought the jury. Crisco and its imitators, along with the newer margarines flooding supermarket shelves, marketed themselves aggressively as the heart-healthy alternative, plastering cholesterol-free claims across packaging even when the underlying science remained contested and incomplete. Doctors began recommending vegetable oils to patients. School cafeterias switched their fryers. Cookbook authors quietly rewrote their recipes, swapping out the tub of lard on the counter for a bottle of oil that promised virtue instead of guilt. It was, in essence, Crisco's original 1911 pitch: purity and modernity versus animal-derived old-fashionedness, except now it came wrapped in white coats instead of advertising copy. Here is the part the industry did not advertise: the hydrogenation process that made vegetable shortening solid and shelf-stable, the very innovation that had built Crisco's fortune, produced trans fats as a byproduct, artificial fat molecules that the human body did not evolve to process. Decades later, those trans fats would be identified as a significant contributor to coronary heart disease, arguably worse for cardiovascular health than the saturated animal fat they had been invented to replace. Regulators eventually moved to restrict and then effectively ban artificial trans fats from the food supply, an admission, however quiet, that the substitute sold for generations as the healthy choice had been anything but. Think about that for a second. An entire industry rose by convincing the public that grandmother's lard tin was a health hazard, only for the replacement product to be unmasked, decades later, as the more dangerous fat all along. Lard, meanwhile, had spent that same half-century in cultural exile, banished to the realm of unhealthy nostalgia, blamed for a public health crisis that the science, in hindsight, had oversimplified and the marketing had gleefully exploited. The irony writes itself. The fat pushed out under the banner of protecting your heart was replaced by one that may have quietly done more damage. And it would take the regulatory system the better part of a century to catch up to the deception. So here we are, back where we started, with a fat that once sat in nearly every kitchen in America, now treated as a relic, a punchline, a thing your great-grandmother used because she did not know any better. Except that framing, as we have seen, was never really about health. It was about advertising budgets, patent chemistry, wartime munitions, and a cholesterol panic that the food industry itself helped engineer. And now, quietly, without much fanfare, lard is creeping back. Walk into a serious pastry kitchen today, and you will likely find a tub of it sitting next to the butter. Not out of nostalgia, but because professional bakers rediscovered what 19th-century pastry cooks already knew. Lard produces a flakier, more tender crust than any vegetable shortening can manage, because its fat crystal structure creates larger, more distinct layers in dough. Pie competitions are won on this fact. Culinary schools teach it. Chefs who spent careers cooking with canola and margarine have gone back to rendering their own leaf lard. The fat surrounding a hog's kidneys, prized for its clean flavor and superior texture, sourcing it from small farms and butcher shops, the same way frontier households once did out of necessity rather than trend. Home cooks, driven by a broader skepticism of industrial food and a curiosity about traditional techniques, have followed. Food writers who once would not print the word without an apology now describe lard-based biscuits and tamales and confit as benchmarks of authenticity. Nutrition science, too, has grown more cautious about its old certainties, with some researchers now questioning whether saturated fat was ever the primary villain the post-war panic made it out to be, and whether the demonized farmhouse fat was, in the end, less dangerous than the industrial substitute that replaced it. None of this makes lard fashionable in the way kale or avocado toast is fashionable. It remains a minority choice, a connoisseur's ingredient, a small rebellion against a century of marketing. But its return tells you something the whole story has been telling you from the start: that what we eat is never simply a matter of taste or health, but of economics, propaganda, war, and corporate ambition, dressed up as personal choice. So think back to that opening statistic, the near-total vanishing of a fat that once greased nearly every meal cooked in this country. That disappearance was not progress. It was not science. It was not even really about food. It was Procter & Gamble protecting a candle business that became a food empire. It was a war that turned kitchen grease into ammunition. It was a cholesterol panic built on incomplete evidence and industry funding. It was a trans fat substitute that proved more dangerous than the thing it replaced. Lard did not fail us. We were sold a story, and the story, like so much of history, turns out to have been written by whoever stood to profit from the ending. The next time you reach for a tub of shortening without a second thought, remember that you are holding the residue of a 100-year marketing campaign, not a health decision. And somewhere behind that decision sits a rendered white fat, once currency, once ritual, once wartime contraband, quietly waiting for its reputation to catch up with its history. Grease, it turns out, was never just grease. It was power, rendered down and sold back to us as fear.